Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself speak with the art historian and author, Katy Hessel.
We spoke to Katy about discovering the world of museums and art history as a child, about the Instagram account that turned into the story of art without men, and about her latest book, How to Live an Artful Life.
This is a great episode, and if you've enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Katy, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the podcast. We wanted to start with your new book, How to Live an Artful Life. Can you tell us about where this project came from and the sort of central ideas that you're engaging with in it?
Yeah, so How to Live an Artful Life. Firstly, it's fantastic to be on. Thank you so much for having me. How to Live an Artful Life is really the result of hundreds of hours of interviews that I've done over the last decade or so. I have a podcast, the Great Women Artists podcast, where I interview artists on their career, or writers, artists, curators, or even family members on the artist who means most to them. And after every single interview, I always kind of decompress and write down what I've learned from those artists. And it could be about photography, about seeing the world, how Sally Mann, sets up a camera. It could be how Judy Chicago, how she has that courage to kind of fight for change. It could also be about love and relationships, Tracy Emin on romance, Marina Abramovich on doing nothing. And I have all of these, hundreds and hundreds of hours. And me and my editor really wanted to do something with them because it was 10 years since I started Great Women Artists on Instagram. And what's a way to celebrate them? And while there's a really brilliant book called Art Talk that came out in the 1970s that were conversations between Cindy Nemser, who was an amazing art historian, and artists like Barbara Hepworth and Eva Hesse and Alice Neal. And I love books of interviews, but I don't feel like people read that today. What we wanted to do was extract quotes from those episodes and almost create like a bite-sized version and then put them into a sort of calendar year. So really it was the result of so much work that had already been done, but we didn't know how to put it in one place yet.
And so did you have the bits from each episode that you already knew you wanted to use, or was it a case of kind of sifting back through transcripts and kind of picking out and then editing and curating that way?
Yeah, it was totally that, because also when you write a book like How to Live an Artful Life, which is effectively a kind of calendar or almanac, it's a quote for every single day of the year. And obviously you have to be mindful of the seasons as well. So firstly, what we did is actually we sort of mapped out what the year looked like. I love the idea of clocks. I love the idea of the seasons and each season or month having a personality to it, whether it's sort of January is about new beginnings, February is about love and passion, August is about beauty, September is about time. There are so many kind of ways of thinking about the year. And so we sort of painted that picture first. And then I went through all the archive, which was quite an extensive job. Not great to hear my voice back so much, but it's about the artist, so it's all right. And sifted out important quotes, or as I said before, those quotes that I'd sort of taken from before. 50% of the book is quotes from my interviews with artists. 50% of it is archive, because I love lines from poems, lines from people's speeches, lines from this. And again, I want to sort of create a compendium of this. And so what I did was, in that process, got together the themes and then went through all the quotes and sort of marked up what themes those quotes could take. Some were just about love. Some could be about love and memory and joy, which is December. So really it was about kind of color coding everything and then eventually putting it all together, which took a long time. I mean, it sort of sounds easier than I'm saying it, but there was so much umming and ahhing. And also, how do you kind of create a pace within the months as well? The first of the month is very different to the 20th of the month. So it was kind of like thinking about that journey throughout the month, and also thinking about special days, whether it's Earth Day or, sometimes occasionally I'd include what the artist's birthday is on that day, but no one actually really knows about that. And of course you have festivals like Christmas or all sorts of things. So it was this kind of amazing web that we finally kind of flattened and straightened out into a story of the year.
And you mentioned that this came out of a conversation with your editor. Was it initially an idea that you brought to them, or did they bring it to you? Was it your publishers looking for a kind of follow-up after the big success of your previous book? Where did the kind of original seed of the idea come from?
So I've been working on a book for about 3 years now. And it's a book that is still, taking over my entire mind. And I've just actually published a children's version of The Story of Art Without Men. And when you have this kind of, second album syndrome or whatever, I had no idea The Story of Art Without Men would be a success. I'd never even known anyone who'd ever written a book before. I went totally into it blind, which I think is the best way, actually. Sally Mann, in her book Artwork, has this amazing quote which she talks about naive determination. And I think that's always the kind of conviction that you should carry. And so because of this, I was really struggling with this book that I hope to bring out in the next couple of years, which I absolutely adore kind of the research, but it's so rigorous. I've had to learn the Bible, I've had to learn classics, etc., etc. And so we wanted to kind of create something that would be a kind of, stepping stone as well, because I think, there's so much pressure of that second book. Why not make a couple of books in between? I mean, my friends laugh at me that the way I procrastinate is by writing another book. But also, it was a way of lifting myself out of this thing. So, it was really difficult writing again. And I needed that kind of courage and inspiration. And in a way, I kind of wrote this book, How to Live an Artful Life, which is full of prompts and encouragements and etc. for myself. And I think it really got me out of a sort of creative rut and gave me the kind of courage and inspiration to go forward. Just this morning, I was speaking to all sorts of year sevens at a school in Tower Hamlets in London. And, what they were asking really conscientious questions. They said, what do you do when you face criticism? Or how do you have the strength to continue and have that courage? And I said, I put that all in a book so I would know whenever that would happen to me is to go to the wisdom of people like Louise Bourgeois or Marina Abramovich or whoever.
I saw somewhere else that you said when you're struggling with a creative block, you write in the form of letters. Is that something that you've done here, kind of framing each entry almost as a letter in your mind to a kind of imaginary reader so that you could kind of help get the words on the page?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, I love letter writing. I did a talk with Edmund Duval and Celia Poole a few years ago at the London Library all about letter writing, because he wrote his fantastic Letters to Commando and she wrote her amazing Letters to Gwen John. And I find the kind of idea of letter writing so romantic, whether it's to someone who's no longer here, whether it's to someone who we love, whether it's a letter that you'll never actually send. And also it could be a letter to your creative self as well. And I think that's totally it. I've written sort of letters to artists before that I'm never going to send because they're not around anymore. But I kind of like that we could interact with people through that form. And I think, and I totally agree with lots of writers who say it's, don't consider the reader, just write in your voice. But I don't know. I really do think about my reader. I think because I write in, I write art history, which has often been seen as quite an elitist subject. And I'm so mindful of so many people I know, especially, who say, art's not for me, it's over there. And so I really want to say, no, it can be this thing that actually is part of your life. It can be part of your daily routine. You can go to artists for so many things. So I'm really mindful of how my reader feels. And I should add, the format of the book is so it's a quote by an artist or writer for every day of the year, and then I respond to it as a way for that quote to reflect onto the writer's life. For that quote to reflect onto the reader's life. Because also, the quote might be quite abstract. So how do we think about it in a way? And so it was quite fun, sort of having a sort of strange conversation. But I guess that's what writing is, a kind of silent conversation in the mind.
We always like to talk about the kind of mechanics of how books are put together. We were also interested because we produced a book based on our own podcast interviews and amalgamating stuff. And we wondered, in terms of that actual process of like sifting stuff from your archive, how did you do that? I mean, we found that automated transcription was a huge help with that kind of thing, because you could word search. I mean, how did you go about just, passing the material together and then working out what it was you wanted to use?
The way I work with my podcast editor is that we work on a transcript. So once the podcast episode is done, we'll use Otter AI or we'll use Descript, two programs that give you a transcription, and then you can actually listen while you read the episode. And that, for me, that way I know what to cut and how to switch things around if need be, or to add questions or whatever. And so I already had a transcript for every single episode. So there were those things, but also on my notes phone, on the notes app on my phone, I keep so many quotes the whole time. And actually, one of the episodes that was most impactful, I've actually had him on. I've had a few people back on twice. One of who is Hilton Als, who was the fantastic writer and theatre critic for the New Yorker, curator, etc. And he said this really moving thing on the podcast, which is, if we have language, then we should share that language. It's almost like our duty to. And so I love this idea of, it being a sort of giving thing. I think all artworks are gifts in so many ways, and I think books are too. But sorry, back to your question about how the sort of process. I think, I already had those transcriptions, so it was kind of, but also it was also listening to these interviews afresh to see, oh, did that person say that thing, or am I imagining it as well?
And you said that no one really reads interview books anymore, or it's a kind of, the almanac is sort of out of fashion these days. When you pitched it to publishers, did they, balk at that, or did they think, there's great people going to be quoted in it, we're super keen? What was the reaction to your idea like?
Sorry, I feel like the idea that they're out of fashion is a terrible comment from me. I totally take that back. I think, I have 180 interviews, and so it's to have that in a book would just be kind of ridiculous, I think. Well, from my side anyway. Sorry, your question was about how did I pitch it? Well, like I said, it was me and my editor, Helen Conford, who is just a marvel. I mean, I will do anything that she says, and anything that, we have these meetings where we come up with ideas together. I mean, the story of Art Without Men was born in one meeting. And I just completely trust her. And I thought it was such a great way of putting these interviews to good use. Yeah.
And were you conscious of, I mean, we talked a bit about what the boundaries of the genre are here, not almanac, but maybe not self-help is probably wrong as well. I mean, the book that I sort of thought of thinking about this was The Artist's Way by Julia Margaret Cameron. Was that something that you had in mind at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an artist called Victoria Cantons who actually talks about that in November as one of her routines. Yeah, I love these books. I love artist quotes. I love knowing people's processes. That's why I'm so obsessed with art history and why I interview every artist I possibly meet, because I want to understand how they see the world. How does something that is nothing, how does it get birthed into an image that can sort of reflect our lives back to ourselves? How do we explain this sort of abstract, mystical, magical thing called art to people? It's been amazing learning from all of these artists and their family members. One of my favourite quotes in the book, and actually it was probably one of the first quotes I said just has to go in, was the 2nd of January, which is a Paula Rego quote, but it's told by her son, Nick Willing, who's a fantastic documentary filmmaker and director. He made the documentary about Paula Rego's Secrets and Stories that I urge all your listeners to watch. And, when he was growing up, he was saying, why, Mum, why are you always going to the studio? What even is an artist? And she said that an artist is someone who goes to a place where no one's ever been before, but brings back something that you or I have never seen, but we instantly recognize. And that, for me, is totally sums up what art is. It's a bit like sort of Emily Dickinson's quote about, art being telling the truth, but tell it slant. And how do we describe all these intangible things, or these works of art that are so personal to all of us? We see them in so many different ways, yet they kind of have an effect on any of us. I love this idea of art being something that can bind together communities or ages. I talk in the book, if it, and also there's a great quote by Ali Smith on the 3rd of January as well, which talks about this idea of, art, it kind of enthralls all of our senses. It helps you make sense. It gives you sense, etc. And also it's there to be discussed and debated, and, it's there to be loved or hated or adored or to get angry at. There are so many ways of using art. And it can totally bind ages together in the sense that, a 17-year-old can watch a movie or look at an artwork, experience a sculpture, read a piece of poetry, and so can a 94-year-old, and they can have that conversation together. I think, and art is something that just gets richer with more people joining the conversation. And, for me, I think that's what I want to do with this book, is really kind of, I don't know, remind people of that, because we live in a world where, in a way, so many of us look at the world through our iPhone, whereas there's something about artists, even though artists obviously can be any one of us, but it's the way that they really notice beauty. You know, I talk about in January with Ruth Asawa, this idea of, you know, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary or whatever. And although that sounds, you know, whatever, it is so true, because if you think about her sculptures, these kind of cocooned, looped, wide sculptures that change and create shadows when you put light onto them, they become silvery, they become matte-like. But, you know, they all stem from that single medium, which is just a piece of wire. And I think that's what artists do. They give you the tools to see beauty in something, see the potential in something. I think that's what I've learned most from artists, is that idea of possibility, of, you know, going out and doing that thing.
That was fascinating. You mentioned AI explicitly in the introduction, and I wondered whether the rise of those technologies had made this feel more urgent. You talk about, you know, it's never been more important to turn to those who can help us lead creative lives. Do you see this book as a kind of riposte of a kind to kind of technological development of recent years?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's also a reminder to myself as well about the joys and the how essential it is to create, and how essential it is to dream and imagine, and how that is so part of it should be so part of our world. You know, I mean, I'm going into schools every day at the moment because I've just published my children's book for sort of age 8 to 14, and it's amazing the what they come up with just looking at this one painting that has nothing to do with any of our lives, that, you know, was painted 400 years ago. And I think that, you know, art, it makes us think about time in such an extraordinary way. Why do art galleries still exist? Because these works were made with care, they were made with time, they were made by that person. You know, I go to a book because I want to read that person's writing. I don't want to read someone's writing through AI. It's boring. It's, you know, imagine if we could access, or you know, in the 100 years ago in the 1920s, they had some form of this or whatever, where their work was semi-skewed. You know, you don't have that access. The world that we live in is going to be defined by artists and writers and those who leave that trace and that relic. And if we do that filtered through an AI technology, it won't have that burning passion that art can give you. I think, you know, art is electrifying. The way that people see the world is extraordinary, no matter who we are. All of our stories matter. And so, you know, I obviously love it so much, but I want other people to feel like they can be part of it and understand its importance. And also, whatever profession we go into, you know, especially politicians, they need more than ever to have that creative output, and also that creative thinking can lead to rational decisions as well. You know, I just interviewed Catherine Rundell, one of my absolute heroes, for World Book Day, a sort of special for my podcast. And, you know, obviously her writing on John Donne is extraordinary. He was a poet and a politician and a dean of, you know, St. Paul's Cathedral. I mean, you know, so many different things. And I think that's what artists show us. There's so many possible routes in life. It doesn't have to be linear.
And another kind of process question from me: when it comes to getting permission to reproduce works of art in a book, how onerous a process is that? Could you talk us through, you know, how that works, and then what are the differences depending on if it's something from the 16th century versus contemporary and stuff like that?
Simon, that is such a good question, which is so part of the process, which I've actually never been asked in my entire career. And, you know, with the story of Art Without Men, I took on a lot of that picture editing role myself because it cost money. Pictures can be extortionately expensive. Where the money goes, actually, someone asked me this the other day, just a friend. If it's, you know, a work which is over 100 years old, it means it's sort of out of copyright. But obviously, if a museum owns it, they charge money for that. And actually, that's how lots of institutions and estates make their money as well. It's not going to a family because the person was around 400 years ago, but it's going to the Uffizi, it's going to the National Gallery, it's going to, you know, the Belvedere in Vienna or whatever. And but also there are free images I forget what it's called, but if you Google it, images without copyright. And there are a couple of those images in the book, such as the sort of Emma Sivvy style quote. The Emma Sivvy style quilt. In the story of Art Without Men, but if the artist has been alive for the last 100 years, chances are they're gonna have you're going to have to buy the images through Bridgman Images or DAX. It's ARS in America. And also you have to sort of get permission from estates as well. So, I mean, I have the sort of world's most amazing database for getting in touch with any women artist over the last 500 years in a way, because I just wrote to everyone possible. I mean, to the point where I hand wrote letters to people. I asked them 7 times, on the 7th try. I have to get permission for quotes as well from speeches. And one of those, it was on my 7th try that I got it for How to Live an Artful Life, because I thought it was so important. And, I'm very lucky that I have a lot of connections in the art world, because I worked in commercial galleries. I interview heads of estates. I interview family members, so I can, really ask them for favors. And my God, I mean, I sort of sold both my kidneys doing the story of Art Without Men just to try and get the prices down. And I also ended up paying for a lot of those images myself, because I knew that was going to make the book. That's what makes art books are the images. And so it's really tricky, but there are ways around it to get the price slightly down. But it's an extensive task that, almost, I often think with books, it's sort of half writing, it's half promoting in a way. But with books like mine, it's probably, even 35% writing, 15% images, and then 50%, really bringing it out in its life. It sort of goes from its childhood to its teenagehood to its adulthood. So yeah, it's a really, really good question. It's very complicated, but you can get there.
It's great to hear. Thank you for the thorough explanation. Speaking of childhood and adolescence and all of that, can we talk now about your own life? So you grew up in London and you had art history classes at the National Gallery, if I'm right in thinking that. Was that kind of when you fell in love with art and art history?
It was actually really when I was a child. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and my elder sister Sarah is amazing at art. She works for Formula One now, but she is an incredible creative mind, and she's 9 years older than me. And so when I was 6 and she was 15, if your sister's 15 and she's going to take you to the Tate Modern or the V&A or the National History Museum, you are going to say yes, because already you're copying single thing they do. You're wearing all their clothes, etc. And so that was really wonderful, because it was a sibling who sort of really introduced it to me. And, I was 6 when the Turbine Hall, or the Tate Modern, opened in London. And, I still remember being a kid, again, because those museums were free, that I could go to these places. I remember, the first time I ever took the tube by myself, I went to go and see Chris Ofili at the Tate Britain. It was possible. And I'm always saying to kids, I said to them this morning, I was like, the museums are free in this country. You can use them however you want. You don't have to know anything about it before. You can just go in and think about what kind of questions to ask when you're in front of that artwork. And that's what Sarah really did. She always encouraged me to bring my sketchbook. She also lived in Florence for a bit. And so I remember going to the Uffizi with her and her being like, sketch this like this. And because of that, there was no kind of, oh, you should know this, or this kind of, I don't know, it was fun. She made it so relevant and exciting, and I just wanted to be her, basically. And so that's really where it came from. And because I grew up in London, I was able to go to those museums on a Saturday afternoon or in half term, and also commercial galleries as well, whether it's White Cube. I remember I went to school in central London, and there was a Christian Marclay exhibition, so The Clock, which is one of the best artworks in the world. If anyone's never heard of it, do look it up. It's a 24-hour working clock. Christian Marclay spliced together hundreds of thousands of films, and at each like sort of 10-second scene, it has a clock all the time in it. And so it's actually a working clock. So for example, if I would go before school to White Cube again because it was free, it would be sort of breakfast time, it would be alarms going off and all these things. And then because I went to school in central London, we did have lessons in the National Gallery, and my God, we all knew how lucky we were. It was just extraordinary. And I just think, we've got these amazing resources. Use them, and use them however you want as well. Go in and do what Hisham Matar tells you on August the 6th or whatever, which is, just look at one painting and maybe go back to just that one painting the next day or the next week or the next month. See how it makes you feel. There's no right or wrong way to do it.
And could you tell us about your steps into working in commercial art? So you worked at Sotheby's and then later at the Victoria Miro Gallery. Tell us about how you kind of ended up in those institutions, and then what were the roles you were doing there?
So at Victoria Miro, I started off as an intern when I was 18. And because I was 18, I didn't really sort of understand hierarchy in galleries or in workplaces. So I sort of spoke to everyone as if they were kind of, on the same level. And as a result, I became really close with the family. And, I felt like I was raised at Victoria Miro. And it was the most amazing education I could have got, because their program is just extraordinary, especially when it comes to painting. I went to UCL. And throughout those 3 years, I worked at Victoria Miro every single Saturday, and oftentimes in the evenings if they had events and stuff. So what was great was that I had an actual job while I was at university. I was being paid, but I could work actually in something that I wanted to, which was amazing. And you have that education, when you're sitting on the front desk, which is how most people start out in the art world, sort of as a front desk girl. You see everyone coming in and out of the gallery. You sort of start to work out who people are. What is a museum curator? What is this? Okay, or you're sorting out the post, and you're saying, okay, well, what do the people in the registrars do? What do the people do in the archive do? What are the people, etc., etc. The image rights people, etc. So it's so great to kind of work out the kind of ecosystem of how galleries worked. And I started off as an intern. I then worked in the communications, and then I started working in exhibitions, and I eventually brought artists on. I curated a show when I was 25 there, and they ended up representing 2 of those artists. And it was just, it was such an amazing gallery, because it was like a sort of big family. And my gosh, I'm so kind of grateful for them just letting me go with my enthusiasm on it, because I think in a sort of bigger gallery, I wouldn't have had that. But because it was London, it was local, it sort of felt possible. And I loved it. I was so sad. I think I cried in my interview, my meeting, when I said I had to leave because I've just got too much on. So a couple of months before I published The Story of Art Without Men, I sort of didn't want to let go that much.
That's quite sweet. You were studying the history of art while you were working there, and you've obviously used that degree constantly in your work, but I guess one of the criticisms of the degree, along with various other humanities subjects, is that people do these degrees and then they don't use them, and it's sort of a waste of people's time and energy. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that, like you said, people probably use these degrees without realizing, whether it's a thinking degree in a way. Humanities get you to see different perspectives, whether it's English literature and you're reading something, or it's art history and you're looking at something. They get you to see the world from a different perspective. And actually, I think what these degrees can do is they can, if you're lucky enough to study at university, there are these 3 years, and use them how you want. And actually, everything is what you make of it. In a way, you could be studying events management and then then go into art history. Or I really think that it's not about. I mean, it is in so many ways about what you're studying, but it's how you use it. There's a great quote in the book by Rachel Whiteread, who's a fantastic artist. And she said, even if you're working in a coffee shop and you want to be an artist, you can still think like an artist. And so I think that's something, and also I think that's what humanities teaches you as well. It gets you to get outside of yourself. It shows you the expansive wonder of the world. And I really do believe that if you say, okay, well, I'm going to do art history, but then I'm going to go into politics, amazing. What did you learn from that degree that can speak to what you're going to now? I think we can get so sort of bogged down in the prescription and the going on the right path, and actually we've lost sight of the fact that these degrees can take us anywhere. Like I said, my sister did history of art. She now works for Formula One. But that kind of education in images, of image theory, except the history of art, thinking about except marketing, etc. That totally probably carried her to where she is now. And I think it's sort of I think humanities subjects teaches you about that possibility, and I think always when you're applying for a job or something is to say, I may have done this, but actually it can really relate this way. Everything is what you make of it, I think.
What's your view on the kind of class element in the UK? History of art, fairly or unfairly, has a kind of certain stigma as attracting students, particularly from a certain social background. Do you think that is accurate? And if so, is it a problem? And if it is, what could be done to change that?
Yes, I think, it's a huge problem. And there are amazing groups in the art world, that really fighting this change. Museums were built at a certain time in the 18th and 19th centuries for a certain man of a certain class. Still today they represent very narrow margins of what society actually is. The National Gallery still has just 1% of its collection dedicated to women artists. And I think that, what was amazing about the 1990s and the 2000s was this kind of boom of regional museums, the Hepworth Wakefield, Turner Contemporary in Margate, Hastings Contemporary, etc., etc. And, this idea that a museum didn't have to be a thing in a big city, it could be something in your local area. And so in a way that changed something. And also the fact that museums are free in England, in the UK, is extraordinary. But in terms of arts jobs, I think it's still something that there is so much work to do. You know, the reason why I don't have a master's is because I had to go out and work. I would have loved to have done that, but I didn't really have that option because my parents weren't going to pay that for me, pay for that. So I went out and worked. Maybe I'll do a master's one day. Maybe I'll do a PhD. But I think in terms of, and the Courtauld have done this amazing program to try and get as many to get more kids from different classes in different parts of the UK studying art history at university level. I mean, the problem is that our government doesn't believe that art history is a kind of proper subject, so state schools don't offer it in so many places. Unfortunately, it still very much tends to lean towards private schools. But actually, that's what I'm trying to do with my children's book, to ages 8 to 14, is to go into all sorts of different schools and say, this is what art history is. Okay, you might not sort of, and also there are amazing groups like Art History Link Up that like, get kids who are in state schools to do art history A-level that way. There are so many, but it's about sort of making people aware of that. It's making people aware that these places are for them and they are allowed in these cultural institutions as well. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my children's book. But I think we still have a huge way to go, and I think it's yeah. But I do think there is progress.
That's heartening. Speaking of your own teenage years, you were already writing kind of little mini art reviews when you were going to galleries and museums. But you've said elsewhere that it was reading Olivia Laing when you were 21 that kind of reshifted your perspective on art writing and what it could be. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so when I was 21, my friend Flo gave me The Lonely City, and it was a book that just made me reconsider everything in terms of art and the possibilities of what it could be. The Lonely City is such a beautiful book. It's actually its 10-year anniversary this year. They're about to bring out a new copy, and I think Tilda Swinton has done the audiobook, which is the coolest thing ever. And it's a book that follows a few artists such as Andy Warhol or Edward Hopper or David Wojnarowicz or Zoe Leonard. It looks at their work through the lens of their lives, but also is a kind of part memoir that looks at their works through the lens of loneliness. And loneliness is the kind of most extraordinary emotion because it's something that you can't just tap into. And it's such a personal emotion as well. You don't share loneliness with people in lots of ways. But what this book can do, it can kind of take you to that such sometimes insular emotion that you feel when you're lonely. You feel like the only person in the world is experiencing that loneliness. And Livia Lang writes so movingly about this. They're living in New York City at the time. Even the fact that there are so many people around them and they can see so many lights on, it doesn't take away from the fact that they're still alone. If anything, it kind of exacerbates that loneliness. But what that book did for me is it showed me, like I said earlier, about the possibilities of art writing and how it can kind of come from the soul in so many ways. I was studying art history at university. I loved it, but I wanted to. I think personally for me, I'm not an academic. I want to access that kind of feeling. Whenever I do my podcasts, I always begin. It could be amazing scholars like Griselda Pollock or Bryony Furr or whoever, and I say, how does this work make you feel? I want to kind of get to the heart of it because that's my personal relationship with art. It's not everyone else's, but that's the way I like to approach it. And so that's what Olivia Lang's book did for me. And it also gave me the courage, I think, to write from that place. And I think probably inadvertently, look at the world of art through the lens of women artists in so many ways. And I love the fact that, there are these kind of gifts that some people give you that might seem so minor when you give them, but actually are so extraordinary. There's a quote from my book in February by Helen Schurfbeck, who's a Finnish artist, and she, when she was younger, she went through had experienced lots of illnesses, and her father gave her a set of pencils and paper, and she says, when you give a child a pencil, you give them an entire world. And it's this idea that actually you never know the impact that something that you give someone, whether it's also just a word of encouragement, will have on their life.
Hello, listeners. This is a notice to say that we have once more improved our crowdfunding offerings.
Firstly, we now have a subscription option on Apple Podcasts, where you can hear extra exclusive content from our guests in mini episodes that come out in between the main instalments of the show.
Secondly, on Patreon, we're continuing to offer the bundle of successful journalistic pitches, which goes to anyone who contributes $5 a month or more. You can read pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Economist, The Washington Post, New Scientist, GQ, and the BBC. The whole compendium runs to a whopping 160 pages. Go to patreon.com, that's patreon/always take notes to see the full list of publications included in the pack.
Anyone who contributes $10 per month or more now also gains access to the exclusive mini episodes. You can listen for free to a sample mini episode with novelist Lee Child on our Patreon page. At that price point, you also get a signed copy of our book. The first 10 new sign-ups at this level will likewise receive a license to Scrivener worth £55. 7 of those are left. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, non-fiction books, academic papers, and even scripts.
Lastly, anyone who contributes $15 a month or more gets all of these benefits, plus an Always Take Notes mug. They can also join an exclusive monthly call with us to discuss any aspect of their writing lives, including workshopping pitches. All paid Patreons have the opportunity to chat online with other supporters of the show and also to submit questions for upcoming interviews. Once again, you can find all the offers at patreon.com/always take notes.
And could you take us now to this moment in 2015, the beginning of the Great Women Artists kind of project as an Instagram? So this visit you made to an art fair, take us back then and talk us through how things kind of snowballed after that.
So yes, I just finished my degree, and I'd been studying the work of Alice Neal, who still remains my favourite painter in the world. She was a painter of people who lived from 1900 to 1984, and while that might not sound groundbreaking, what she did is she painted the conversations she had. She painted the people who walked in and out of her apartment, whether it was in Spanish Harlem or whether it was in the Upper West Side in New York City from the 30s to the 80s. And she painted with such kind of conviction and expressiveness and realness. I mean, when you see her painting, they feel so fresh. They don't feel 50 or 60 or 70 years old. They feel so now because she was painting in such a kind of urgent, present way. But, Alice Neal, she was recognised with a small exhibition at the Whitney 10 years before she died. But really, it took until 2021 for her to be properly recognised in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where there were queues round the block to see her work. But sorry, she, like many women artists at that time, died in 1984 with an apartment stacked full of paintings. And I sort of noticed this pattern that was happening. So that was already playing on my mind. And then I went to an art fair and I looked around me at all the artworks in front of me and I couldn't see a single one that was by a woman. And maybe that was just where I was looking, I don't know, but I had this kind of epiphany, this realization that I couldn't name 10 women artists off the top of my head, let alone any pre-1900. And so I thought, okay, well, if you love art that much, you clearly have not done the right work. And it's up to me to actually do that work for myself. So literally, I couldn't sleep that night. I created an account called The Great Women Artist that was sort of paid homage to an amazing, trailblazing feminist art historian called Linda Nochlin, with her essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And I began this kind of journey. And it wasn't really for anyone, it was for myself. I said to myself, just write about a woman artist every single day and post about it. And also, that was also where I kind of like developed my writing style as well, because I struggled with writing before that. And so, everyone starts with 0 followers with an account, and then eventually people started following along. So it's been an amazing time, and it's given me incredible access. It's allowed me to meet my heroes, but I still do it. I love to do it as a sort of creative exercise in a way.
What are the strengths and drawbacks, I guess, of using Instagram as a tool for this kind of work? I mean, is there a kind of art to the I mean, there is an art to an Instagram caption, but how have you found writing in that format? Over the course of this 10-year plus period, how have you kind of honed your craft in that form?
I talk about this in How to Live an Artful Life, my process when I'm in front of an artwork. But really, if I'm looking at an artwork, so for example, now I've got tons of postcards on my wall in front of me. What I'll do, I'm looking at Modigliani, I'm looking at Rachel Rausch, and Artemisia, and everyone. What I would do is I'd look at that painting and I'd just start describing what I see. And then once you sort of start downloading everything you see, suddenly you see other things come to life. A painting is a kind of time-based medium. Not only does it take time to make, and it's a series of decisions on the canvas in front of you, or whatever art form, whether it's a play or words and etc., but somehow it comes to life if you really look at it. And so with the Instagram, my favorite, the way I kind of use it, for example, I was in the Tate Modern last week and I came across this amazing Lisa Bryce painting. And Lisa Bryce is an extraordinary artist because she often kind of unearths characters from art history into her paintings. And so you think, oh my God, that's the Matisse nude, that's the Suzanne Valadon, that's the Balthus, that's the Degas, Miss Lala, etc. from the National Gallery. And so I just sat there and I just wrote what I saw, and that's kind of how I use it. Then I upload it to Instagram. I don't care if I get 0 likes or 10,000 likes or whatever. It's about sort of really noticing something, and I like the immediacy of it because in a way, just like my art diaries, which I've got one of my art diaries here. It's kind of just it's exactly the same as what I used to do. I used to just going to museums and just write what I thought, and that's kind of what the Instagram is. It's kind of logging all the artworks I see and how I feel, etc.
And could you tell us how the story of Art Without Men kind of expanded into different forms, so into a podcast, into a book? Talk us through how it kind of moved forward and into these different areas.
So my hours at Victoria Miro were 10 till 6, and I used to kind of meet people. I know it sounds mad, but I'd always sort of try and meet someone before 10 o'clock, much to probably their dismay, but buy them a coffee. And I'd just try and meet as many people as possible. I was so interested in the art world. I was so interested in artists. I didn't know any artists when I was growing up. I didn't know any writers. It felt like this whole magical, romantic world that existed over there. It wasn't part of my world at all. And what I've grown up to understand is that, well, especially if you have a passion for something, and that's also quite good about Instagram, is that they can sort of see your CV and they can see that you're not, whatever. Although my friend who was an artist who is a great friend of mine now, Antonia Sharing. When I went to her studio for the first time, because I wrote to her to say I loved her work, she was kind of expecting a 6-year-old woman, but I was about 22 and I had a silver leather skirt, and she was like, I was not expecting this at all. But it was about the way the podcast came about, is because I was meeting so many people and asking them about their stories. Especially this artist called Unskilled Worker, who I met in the really early days. And she, came to art much later in life. She taught herself. She began her career on Instagram. And in the kind of the sort of 2016, 2017 time, not many artists were on it. And so it was a kind of amazing time to meet people and realize that it was an incredible tool to showcase your work, to showcase art, but also to connect to people. And so it came from there, because I was just hearing the most amazing stories. I got in touch with Lee Miller's family. I went down to Farley's farm and I heard all about Lee Miller's life. And I thought, my God, how do I broadcast this? And so I eventually taught myself how to use podcast equipment, and off I went. And I still do it now. It's an excuse to meet my heroes and to interview them about great people, great art, etc.
And so then when it came to pitching the book, did you write a proposal? Did you get an agent? Did a publisher come to you and want to turn it into a book? How did the book project specifically come into being?
So the book came about because Pallant House Gallery asked me to give a lecture on women artists. Pallant House Gallery is a fantastic museum in Chichester. And so I made up this talk called Women Artists 1550 to 1945. And I went through my journey, and then I went through kind of key movements with artists in it. And I had this talk. I didn't really think much of it in terms of after I gave it, although people were kind of very interested, especially to learn about those artists who were, working in the sort of 16th and 17th centuries. But then I got an agent, Carolina Sutton, who's brilliant, who took an absolute chance on me and said, I think what you're doing is great. She heard some of my podcasts. I said there should be a book. And, it was a dream to write a book, of course. But it sort of had to be the right thing. And she said, meet Helen Comfort. And me and Helen just got on immediately and totally got me. And like I said, Helen and I came up with it in one sitting. We just thought, okay, let's rewrite Gombrich. I handed Helen the lecture that I'd given, and she said, perfect, this could be this template for the book. I went away and wrote a proposal. I learned how to do that. Someone gave me a template for that. So includes all sorts of things like, what's this book about? Who's it for? How is it relevant today? How would you market it? I mean, if you look at the proposal, it's completely different to the final book, because books have a total life of their own, which is the kind of extraordinary thing about them. You never know what they're going to be, which is part of the frustration and the beauty of them. And then it kind of went from there. But, as I was saying, I was totally blind at how this book would do and what people would think of it. And I just wanted to, I guess I wrote it when I was about 26, and I just wanted to kind of share my findings of what I'd learned so far.
We should say that Carolina Sutton is a former guest on the podcast, and it's a really excellent interview with anyone who wants to listen to her. Could you tell us a little about the process of pulling the book together, in terms of research, in terms of deciding who and where to focus on, primary versus secondary sources? Again, as you probably getting the impression, we love to hear all the kind of mechanics and process questions. So as, it went from this idea to an artifact, how did that all work, and how long did the process take?
So I have to say, lockdown was sort of a blessing and a curse. It was an awful time, but it was this strange open landscape that I had, and time that I had away from my kind of full-time job, that was still demanding days of me, but that I could sort of have more time in a way to think. And I got my contract just before in December 2019. And so really I can hardly remember lockdown, because all I did was write. And genuinely, I can't remember 2021. I have no idea what happened, because I was just writing literally sort of 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And with the book, like I said, I made this proposal. What I did was based on The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich, which was a book that I read and loved growing up, but he didn't include a single woman artist until the 16th edition. So we thought we'd kind of rewrite that. And what I love about that book is that it's a total sort of Bible in the sense that you can, okay, what is Impressionism? I've heard that word before. You can go to your Gombrich and you can look it up and you can, oh, okay, that's it. That's what was happening. It gives you the social and political context. It is beautifully illustrated. It gives you insight into a few artists, but again, sort of just scratches the surface. The way I work in so many ways is, the Instagram is that immediacy. It's what I'm seeing. The podcast are long form episodes, a deep dive into an artist's career. The book is, how can you possibly write 400 words on Cindy Sherman? You have to, because it's a book. And sadly, things need to be cut. I wish my book could be 10,000 pages long, but no one would buy it. It has to sort of be a product at the end of the day. And so I had these, in my proposal, I wrote down these different movements, these different styles. So Renaissance, Baroque, Mannerism, neoclassicism, etc., etc. Obviously, when it came to writing the book, it expanded in ways that I would never expected. I discovered so many artists from just looking at an artist. Each artist would take me down a rabbit hole even further. I because of my podcast, I was kind of already doing the research. I was speaking to the world experts on surrealism, like Alice Mann. I was speaking to people like Bryony Furr on Eva Hesse. And so also speaking to these amazing scholars was like studying for a PhD in lots of ways, but it just wasn't through a university or something. It's just a different mode of education. And again, because I'd had this, I'd been going to museums since a kid. I sort of have lodged in my mind so many artworks. And again, it was that kind of immediacy of being in front of those artworks while it wasn't locked down that I'd posted on my Instagram. And so I could go back to my Instagram and say, oh my God, what was it like when I saw that, Judith Leister work? Or that Rachelreich work in National Gallery. What did I think? And so when you're kind of in front of that work and you download what you think, you're when you go to then write something else that you use it for, you're taken back to that time. It's almost this kind of visceral, emotional sort of internal feeling. And so it's actually really paid off doing the Instagram, which was great. And then, I added so many things. I pushed my deadline back again and again and again. I said, it's not right. It's not right. Everyone was sort of screaming at me. And I said, I need to add this movement in. I need to do this. I need to do that. But of course, at the end of the day, you have to also restrict yourself. And it's heartbreaking. And that's also why I continue doing books. I continue doing podcasts, because I want to broadcast these subjects, but also I want to carry on learning. My kids' book is a version of The Story of Art Without Men, and I've added a whole chapter of First Nations art in Australia because I've since gone to Australia and I've witnessed those works. And so I want to keep expanding the sort of repertoire the whole time. You only know how much you know at that point, and so life can change so much in a day, a month, a year. You can learn so much that can just open up your whole mind to a sort of wealth of information. There's definitely been podcast episodes that I've done with people like Marina Warner, who's one of my absolute heroes, who sort of taught me, just through that one podcast episode, taught me to look at the world in a different way. And from sort of that moment on, you sort of never see the same thing ever again. And then, the book goes through so many different stages. My first draft was abysmal. You sort of hand it in being like, this is great and it's awful. And you have to rewrite so much of it. But actually, I think my biggest advice would be to find an editor who you respect. Helen will sort of, she'll hate me for saying this, but highlight pages and just with a comment, meh. And I'm like, okay, don't worry, I'll just rewrite the whole thing, not a problem. But because I respect her opinion, because I know that she is right. And also a book is made with a team. Although my name's on the cover, my God, it's through so many people. And, I'm very lucky that I know so many experts in so many fields. So I was able to get each section checked by a world expert, which is extraordinarily lucky. And who I'm greatly indebted to. And then, it was, especially the contemporary part, it was interviews with artists. I remember or artists also who are around in the 70s. So, emailing with Judy Chicago, you can't quite believe it, but you are, or Suzanne Lacey, and you're asking them for a little quote, or Claudette Johnson, or Lubaina Hamid, and you can get that kind of immediacy of those primary sources, which is extraordinary.
And it went on to become a Sunday Times bestseller. At what point did you realise it was really gathering momentum and resonating with readers? Was there a particular royalty check, or was it something more kind of ephemeral than that?
So I curated the brilliant people at Victoria Miro said, why don't you have the launch here? And why don't you curate an exhibition of the last chapter of the book? And I was like, oh my goodness, this is just an absolute dream come true. So we had the last chapter of the book was sort of still writing the story of art. So we made that into an exhibition for the whole of September 2022. And so we had a sort of VIP launch or whatever. And then we had a public launch. And literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came. It was amazing. With queues around the block. It was like the street was filled with it. And it was this amazing moment. I thought, oh my God, people know about this. People are excited about this. It was also the 8th of September, which meant halfway through the the launch was cancelled because it was announced that the Queen had died. So although we had this kind of amazing celebration, it was like, okay, we have to sort of reschedule this for 3 weeks time. But I think it was that kind of interest, and I don't know, it just felt like a moment, and it was just so awesome to see so many people as well of different ages, different backgrounds. I think that's what I hope this book is. This book is for absolutely anyone. It is for an 18-year-old girl who lives in Oxford, and it's for a 96-year-old woman who lives in, Derbyshire or Wales or whatever. It's for absolutely everyone, I hope.
What do you think of the line between championing and studying? In that, with a project here where you have a express and clearly worthwhile aim of championing or raising attention on female artists, is there a tendency to let the argument shape the evidence, as it were, rather than vice versa? If in another form of history you went in and you said, like, I'm going to go and write a history book focusing on Italians or something like that, there is a risk that you've decided what the story is before you go and do the research. Do you think that there's ever, I mean, as you've said very correctly, that, traditional histories of art were extremely biased the other way in terms of not featuring women at all. But do you think there's ever a risk of becoming a cheerleader, as it were?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think, and I say this in the introduction to The Story of Art Without Men, this is very much a story of art. It's the story, it's a story of art that from what I understand, being a certain age and the culture that I grew up in, I'm very aware that is missing so much. And also, especially with women artists, so much of that work was destroyed. It was misattributed to male contemporaries. There's a case with Judith Leyster and Franz Hals, and people didn't know until 1897, 300 years after they lived, that actually these works were by her. Or this work in the Metropolitan Museum's collection that they thought was David this entire time. Or, there are so many cases of misattribution and scandal. And all is kind of, I guess I was thinking about how I'd been raised studying the history of art. And in first year in university, you kind of do this course, which is a sweeping kind of introduction to the last 500 years. And so that's really where the kind of foundation of this book came from. There are people like one of my favorite writers, Lauren Elkin, Art Monsters. It's a fantastic kind of, it just completely, breaks down what we kind of consider the art historical canon. And I love that. I love her style of writing. It's very different to mine, but I love the way that she's kind of deconstructed in ways that is unexpected. And in a way, you could argue that mine is, patriarchal in lots of ways because it's kind of succumbing to the Western canon. But what I wanted to do with this book is really introduce everyone to it, because our galleries are sort of set up in this type of way. That's the art history we learn about in this country. It shouldn't be, it's definitely not the be all and end all, but it's a place to start. And so also because women artists so often were seen as the wife of, the muse of, the daughter of, the sister of, etc. I was sick of looking at headlines and saying, Jackson Pollock's wife gets exhibition. She's called Lee Krasner, and she's an extraordinary painter who had a career so much longer than his, and also whether it's the beginning or the end as well, before his career, after his career. And so what I wanted to do with this book is really kind of latch on to that. Okay, what Second World War. What was art like then? What was abstract expressionism? It is that introductory, this introductory form, and would I have written it now? I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. 4 years on, do you, things change. You write in different ways. You include different people because your knowledge expands, and that's the kind of beauty of getting older, is the fact that you are consistently adding to your repertoire, and I think that's kind of most exciting of all.
It's a rule of the show that we always ask about money, so say as much or as little as you'd like, but perhaps in the context of your writing, how has it worked for you over the course of your career so far, with the books, and now you write journalism as well? How do you make it work across all your different projects?
I would say I have about 1,000 jobs. Uh, I don't make my money from writing. I make my money from different outputs and always have. Um, you know, it really depends. I mean, I write journalism for love, basically. And I think that, sadly, we live in a world, and I live in London, where, you can't be an author full time unless you are extraordinarily successful. I've just published 3 books, and it's really, really tough. Um, and so I've always kind of, but I also like the fact that I have different jobs, whether it's kind of more business minded, whether it's on this kind of, I like kind of using my brain for different things. Um, and also, I'm very lucky now. I do a lot of speaking engagements, which I didn't used to be able to do. Um, and so, I mean, my income is extremely random. My accountant sort of says, it comes from hundreds of different places. But you have to make it work, and I want to make it work. So I've tried so hard, and like I said, I sort of ended my full time job at Victoria Mirror, 2 months before I published my first book. I always have worked full time, and just you know found the way. I was lucky. I've never had to care for anyone so far in my life, and so that's kind of freed me up in so many ways. And I also count growing up in London an extraordinary privilege, because I could live at home. I could travel in for free to see these museums. It was an incredible leg up, and so that's kind of what I want to do with the books. Is I don't know, show people, sort of, I don't know, not, I don't want to sort of give something back, because that sounds crass, but I don't know, it is that kind of, I want everyone to be part of this.
We're coming up right against our time limit, but a final question from me is: can you tell us something about the other book that you're working on at the moment? The one you'd mentioned you'd been researching and writing for several years.
Yeah, so I've been giving it as a series of lectures at Pallant House Gallery, and it's about female archetypes. So I'm very interested in how women versus how, especially in history, how women artists versus male artists painted archetypal figures like the Virgin Mary or Mary Magdalene, or Venus or Medusa, and what those narratives perpetuated, and how they kind of became the fixed narrative. But actually, what if we see them from a female perspective? How do we see them anew? And it's all I think about and have done for the last 3.5 years. But I adore it. But yeah.
And a final question from me. I wanted to ask about your love of Artemisia Gentileschi in particular. I've seen you talk about her in various places. She's the epigraph to the story of art without men. When did you discover her work, and what is it about her and her story that has kind of so resonated with you across your career?
Oh my God. If at the end of my podcast, I always say, if you could meet an artist, who would it be and what would you say to them? And I always, if someone was ever to ask me that, I would say Artemisia Gentileschi. She was just, I must have discovered her. Artsy asked me to write an article on Renaissance and Baroque female artists in about 2016. And I remember going to the British Library and looking up an exhibition that happened in 1976 that was curated by Anne Sutherland Harris and Linda Nochlin, that was called Women Artists 1550 to 1950. And I remember discovering her there in a sort of tiny black and white reproduction. And it was I couldn't. Her life story is so extraordinary. She was born in 1593 in Rome. Her mother died when she was very young. She was tasked with raising her two brothers. But she learnt she grew up in her father's studio, because that's how so many artists would become artists in those days, if they had access, if it's sort of they had a powerful male in their life a lot of the time, and. She learnt from her father, Orazio Gentileschi, and what she did is she just took on these such extraordinary subjects in the history of art, these sort of biblical themes, whether it's Susanna and the Elders, or it is Judith beheading Holofernes, or it is, or so many different subjects. And, these were subjects that were historically taken on by men. And so what she does is she shows you these subjects, these stories from a female perspective, whether it's her, virgin mother and child. It's so different to what was happening. You look at a Botticelli sort of Madonna and Child, and then you look at Artemisia, and she's kind of showing the reality of what it was like. And she experienced tragedy in her life as well. When she was 17 years old, she was raped by her father's friend, and forced to kind of go on trial for 7 months and sort of bear her truthness in a sort of court case. And we still have the records of all that court case, so you can actually hear, you can read her voice coming through. And there was an exhibition in 2020 at the National Gallery, which was sadly only open for 6 weeks because of COVID. But my God, I was allowed so many hours in that exhibition, and seeing her work in person just blows you away. The scale of it, the depth of it, the passion of it, the drama, the theatricality, but also the voice of the woman coming through. That voice doesn't hardly exist in history, yet these works show that she was fighting for that change even then, even in the 1620s. And I just think, my God, how did she do it? And she gives me the sort of courage to continue to do what I do.
Well, great. Look, Katy, thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging interview, and wishing you all the very best with How to Live an Artful Life and with your numerous other projects going forward.
Thank you very much for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Katy Hessel. She's on Instagram at katy.hessel, and How to Live an Artful Life is published by Hutchinson Heinemann. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Katy?
I enjoyed talking to Katy. I was thinking and wonder if she's the first person we've spoke to specifically about a project that began as a kind of Instagram or social media post and then became a book, and a successful one at that. I was also interested that her current book is, as she said very openly to us, a project that she has embarked upon because she was finding her follow-up book, her main book, a challenge. And I think this kind of difficult second album syndrome is something that we've often heard and talked about, and that she was commendable for being open by that. And I also thought she engaged with our probing, slightly provocative questions about history of art in a thoughtful manner. What about you?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I thought she was very gracious about our rude questions about the value of art history degrees. And I thought she just had a really infectious enthusiasm for her subject. And in some ways it reminded me of the interview with Mary Beard. She's someone who's passionate about her particular intellectual pursuit, but also passionate about sharing it with others. And I haven't had a chance to look at the Story of Art Without Men, the children's edition, but I think that sounds like a very fun and worthwhile project. Speaking of, what have you been up to, Simon?
I have started work on what I hope are the kind of final set of revisions to my book. So I got notes back from my British and American editors, which they're pleasingly very happy with it. And so it should be published next January in the UK, which is good. So very nice to have that firmly in the diary, which is good to hear. I'm waiting for this big Vanity Fair thing of mine, which is out next month, to emerge. It's a slightly weird situation, as you alerted me to, in that the cover, which features who is it? Kylie, which some celebrity who I'm vaguely aware of, is she shared the cover, which has the teaser line about my story, but obviously the story itself has not yet been published, so slightly on tenterhooks for that. And I also finally finished reading my early 1930s conversion memoir, so a great act of literary determination. I'm now actually reading some unpublished diaries by the same guy, which are completely fascinating, unlike his religious writing. So the account of his time during the First World War, looking after prisoners of war in the Alps. And it's actually incredibly moving because basically all his friends keep dying, and because he has a badly broken leg, he can't join the army, and so has kind of complicated feelings about that. But extraordinary how much more interesting a different text by the same writer can be. Anyway, what about you, Rachel? What have you been up to, and what have you been consuming?
That's what we call range. I have been writing about the launch of SNL UK and the world of sketch comedy in Britain more broadly. In terms of things I've been consuming, I've been reading Lauren Groff's short stories in anticipation of an interview we're doing with her. And I have been watching Last One Laughing and various other silly things online. So, yes, bit of a mix.
Very good. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on X at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or Spotify or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
And we should also remind you that Always Take Notes is now a co-production with Listening Dog Media. Thank you.